Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA, where we share risk intelligence from experts across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vincent, Executive Vice President at SRA. All right, Michael, let's talk a little bit about enterprise risk management best practices, right? Whether that is people, process, technology. Can you give us 3 to 5 of your thoughts around what are best practices in the enterprise risk management area?
Well, Ed, I'm going to start with the most important. So I want our audience to get a pen and write this down because this is really important stuff. As a chief risk officer, your first job is to look at the company's strategic plan and strategy. And because this is the game plan for your bank for the next year or two to grow and to become better. And to go through that and say for each one of those plans, what could go wrong? And so that's the most fundamental risk management. It doesn't require any systems. It doesn't require any people except you. And for each one of those 8, 10, 15 strategic imperatives that your board and management team has approved, you're going to look at it and say, what could go wrong? And what can we do to make sure it doesn't go wrong? And that is the ultimate in risk management. So that really is your starting point for risk management, and constantly interfacing with the management team, on their objectives is critical. I would say the vast majority of banks in the country and chief risk officers don't do them because they've grown up in risk management that looks like internal audit and auditing controls, or they've grown up in compliance and auditing compliance. And it's really uncomfortable for a new chief risk officer or many chief risk officers to say, I don't feel like I have the authority to look at the strategic plan and question that. Who am I as the chief risk officer to question that? In fact, you do have that authority, and that the board needs you to do that. And that without starting there, no matter how good a risk program you put in place, it will always be flawed. It will always have a challenge with it.
Sounds like there's a fundamental shift there, Michael, from being a someone that questions and potentially holds back an organization to someone that actually is really enabling an organization to move forward, right? Plugging into the strategic decision making, kind of moves that chief risk officer, I'll say, from the second row to the first row, if you will, right? To really be a business partner, an ally, and someone that is driving enterprise value within an organization.
Well, and that's exactly right, Ed, because the people that do this well, and there's a lot of studies on this, help make sure the bank does better. Banks perform better, their stock prices increase more, they have more profits. So just focusing on those strategic imperatives, what could go wrong, to make sure they don't go wrong. And the opposite becomes true. Then what you plan gets achieved. And that's really what the goal of the bank organization is. So that's one that if you don't do anything else in enterprise risk management, start there, be focused on it. And when things do go wrong with your strategic goals, and my guess is, over my experience, probably a third to a half of strategic goals are never met from banks. Doesn't mean that, it was the bank isn't still going to have a good year. It means that it wasn't thought through enough, and you can catch them early and get them to improve if you can do that. So that's the first one. Another best practice, refers back to a concept of assessing your risk maturity. If you haven't stepped back and looked at kind of a 30,000 foot view of your organization, and looked at, do I have the right infrastructure in place for the board, for the management team, for audit, risk management, first line? As we mentioned earlier, the Risk Management Association is developed this risk maturity framework to give you kind of a roadmap of all the components that you need to have in your organization. And you can compare it to how well you're doing and where your gaps are. If you don't have that, how do you know where your gaps are? How do you know what your plan should be for the future? How do you know whether you have a good enterprise risk management or a basic enterprise risk management or an ad hoc enterprise risk management program? So I would say all of the chief risk officers should have a risk framework, whether it's one that you develop in-house. Some risk frameworks like PNC Bank are developed in-house and they're pretty good. Or if you need help, the RMA's risk maturity framework. So that I would say, if you don't do that, then you have gaps that you're not going to find out until the regulators come or until something goes wrong. So a third best practice is risk appetite management. And I would say half of the banks in the country don't know what risk appetite management is or don't have a risk appetite statement. And risk appetite management is about working with your board and management team to say, here's the level of risk we're willing to take in credit. Here's the level of risk we're willing to take in liquidity or an operational risk. And here is the outside bound that we're not willing to take. Having those conversations, you may only start out with 10 to 20, topics like cybersecurity or credit. But developing the board's appetite, which is required, if you look at the requirements, the board has to give their appetite to management. Management doesn't give the appetite to the board. But in a lot of cases, boards are not bankers, so they don't know what an appetite statement is. So you may have to facilitate that. Developing that risk appetite statement to say, here's how much risk we're allowed to take. And then measure yourself against that quarterly to make sure that you haven't overstepped your bounds from a risk perspective. So one example of that might be we want to have 12% total risk-based capital at a minimum to feel comfortable. So our capital level should be at least 12% total risk base at a minimum for the board to feel comfortable. Well, that's great. So that's one of your risk appetite metrics, and you're going to measure against it. If the bank drops below 12%, then it's time to, or gets close to 12% before dropping, it's time to have a conversation with the management team and board and say, are we still risk adverse and don't want to go below this number, or can we take more risk? And then the bank operates in that particular perspective. I would say most mature banks have in the neighborhood of about 100 different key indicators that roll up into the risk appetite. And those are in various areas like operational risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, interest rate risk, compliance risk. So you have a handful of limits or risk indicators that get developed for monitoring purposes to know that the bank is within the risk category. So lastly, the biggest issue I see across America with risk organizations is they don't have enough people. So they have the desire to have a really good risk shop, but the CEO or some other management of the team says, you know what, we can only afford 2 risk people, or we can only afford 3 risk people, and do the best you can with 2 or 3. So in a lot of cases, risk professionals are hired into that environment and they're not overly knowledgeable about what the requirements of that role is to do it well and how much staff it takes. So I wouldn't assume that the 2-person ERM unit that you just took over was properly staffed and is doing the right things. I would actually assume the opposite, that it's not properly staffed and it's not doing the right things, and take time to investigate, talk to your other friends in the industry to find out, how are you staffed? What are some of the things that you're doing? go back to that risk maturity framework. That'll give you some guidance. And educate your management team, your CEO and your board, that for a fully functioning bank of our size, we need the following positions to do the job right. So that a lot of times what happens is, and I've seen this firsthand, regulators will come in at some point, they'll say, the chief risk officer is understaffed and is not doing the right things. It makes it up to the CEO, it makes it up to the board, and the board says, well, this chief risk officer doesn't know what they're doing. We should fire him and get a new one. And that happens more often than you would think, because they assume you as the chief risk officer weren't smart enough to figure out what risk infrastructure was needed. They fire you, they hire a new one, and the new one comes in and hires five or six people. And that firing, interestingly enough, is a phenomenon that happens with banks crossing from 9 billion to 12 billion. I would say, in my experience, a third or more of the chief risk officers don't make it over that chasm. And I would say probably a lesser percent don't make it from the 900 million to $2 billion, because they don't know what the expectations are and what the staffing levels are. So those are the 4 of the best practices, I think, that can help you take an introspection on your staff and maybe start looking around at what you can do to help put the right program in place.
Thanks, Michael. So as you said, right, I took out my pen when you said to take down notes. Strategic plan, get that chief risk officer involved with the strategic plan. Number 2, assessing the risk maturity of the organization. Number 3, defining your risk appetite and then managing towards that. And then number 4, on the staffing front, arguing your case, making sure that you get the sufficient resources in place and trained and educated, and you then have an adequate risk team to support the business needs. So
and with that, Ed, you'll have a really well-run risk organization. So that's all you need to make sure you get a good start on.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.